Good evening. I'd like to welcome those that are present as well as those that are joining us online. Kyle, as was mentioned, is sick, and so I received a notice to request to fill in, and I was happy to do it. It's been a while since I've taught in this forum, so I'm hoping that you'll be gracious with me and receive what has been prepared. With grace, and we'll be looking at God's Word, and I know we'll all be benefited as a result of that, regardless of my lack of abilities. Part of the reason why I think I was tapped on the shoulder to do this is because Kyle is aware of the fact that my son Ian and I are teaching a class right now with our young people, and we happen, it's a bit of a serendipity, we are tracking just behind Kyle as he's reached this point in the study around the life of Christ. And so for the last couple of weeks, Ian and I have been able to be here as a primer, a warm-up to what we are trying to do in our class. And so what we're going to do this evening is we're going to revisit some things that took place Monday, the week of Jesus, the last week of Jesus' ministry. And we'll talk about some of the events that happened on Tuesday and Wednesday as well. If you're visiting with us, whether online or in person, again, let me qualify, I am not the normal teacher, I'm not the pulpit preacher here at Buford, and so please give us another opportunity and don't judge us by this cover this evening. So, as was mentioned, we're continuing a study that Kyle has been leading relative to the life of Jesus. And we've gotten to the final few days of his earthly ministry just prior to the crucifixion. Last week, Kyle spent some time going through a study of the cleansing of the temple as recorded in the gospel accounts. And that temple cleansing that was referenced took place the Monday prior to his crucifixion, the day following the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. There are other events that occurred that day that we want to touch on and reference again tonight. One involves the cursing of a fig tree, and another key activity that took place that day that we're going to reference as we study this evening is the miracle of healing for those that were blind and lame that came to Jesus in the temple on that Monday. Now, in addition to those events that took place on that Monday, we're going to focus on what the gospel records record for us as activities that took place on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of that week, if you subscribe to the traditional timeline that Kyle has presented and positioned. Or if you happen to have the alternate view that the crucifixion actually took place a day earlier than that traditional timeline on Thursday, we'll be talking about the events that took place not only on Monday, but Tuesday and Wednesday. So that kind of sets a little bit of the context. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that relative to time and the way we think about time, for us, days begin at midnight. And such was the case from a Greco-Roman perspective relative to their thought process and their marking of days. Okay? Midnight. For the Jew, the day started at sundown. And so we do sometimes find ourselves trying to manage and understand, and Kyle has that spreadsheet with the multiple columns and rows to try to keep us aligned. I just wanted to revisit that. One little thought that I think is interesting, as we think about how we mark, and it's interesting to me how we as human beings in different ethnicities might mark days differently. Think about that day beginning at sundown in the way that the Jewish mind operates. And think about how God describes the events of creation week. Each day involved an evening and a morning. Sequentially, an evening and a morning. So again, in that Jewish mindset, there was an evening first, sundown, and then the morning. So just thought that was interesting. Now, a lot is written in the gospel accounts about these few days that we're talking about. 3 or 4 days, depending upon how you view the overall timeline. There's a lot of material. And so we're not going to be able to do all of that time justice, or all of that content justice in the short time that we have tonight. But hopefully we'll be able to draw out some key lessons, and that's my goal and my objective. So chronologically, again, just to restate before we start jumping into the study, chronologically, on Monday, if we piece together the gospel accounts, Jesus and his disciples left Bethany in what we would call Monday morning, heading toward Jerusalem. And Jesus encounters a fig tree. He curses that fig tree. He enters the temple once he arrives in Jerusalem. Following the cleansing of the temple, many come to him, and he's involved in healing. And then that evening, he returns to Bethany to rest. The next day, piecing again together the gospel accounts, on the way back to Jerusalem, the disciples and Jesus witness the effect of the curse on the fig tree. Jesus returns to the temple, and there are a series of confrontations that Jesus has with a number of different parties, and we'll be talking about that this evening. Jesus then leaves with his disciples, leaves the temple, and begins a journey back to Bethany. And on that trip back, Tuesday evening, he spends some time with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And we have the record of what many refer to as the Olivet Discourse, a discussion about things to come that he is engaging with those disciples on the Mount of Olives. Later that evening, he's entertained at a supper in Bethany with Simon, or hosted by Simon the leper. And he's anointed in that supper as well. So that's just a quick chronology of the activities that take place. Now, as we begin the study, I really want you to get your minds around a couple of scriptures to get the overall setting as we dive into the details. First off, as a reminder, Jesus died on purpose. Jesus died on purpose. And the events that are taking place in this week are causing things to come to a head. As Kyle talked about last week, Jesus was filled with zeal. He was indignant relative to what was taking place in the temple. And that righteous indignation prompted action on his part to cleanse the temple. But we also see the same feelings, at least the same words being used to describe the feelings of the religious leaders that were Jews at the time. Based on what Jesus was involved in doing, they were feeling a righteous indignation, at least righteous in their own eyes, right? It was unrighteous. But they too were feeling indignant. And things were moving and coming to a head relative to these interactions and relative to the fulfillment of prophecy. So with that said, let's look at a couple of verses before we jump into the study. First, I want to look at Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. Luke 21, verses 37 and 38. So, for the most part, as Kyle has mentioned, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very, very run very much in parallel. Some cover some material or some items that others don't, but by and large, there's a lot of overlap. And here, I think there's a good, succinct reference to Jesus' activities over the course of these days. Okay, the days leading up to his final supper, the Last Supper, betrayal, trial, and crucifixion. Verses 37 and 38. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. So this is a very broad brush representation of what I just described, but I think it encapsulates what's happening. And as we think about how Jesus taught, and this is where we're going to get in a few minutes into some more detail, two things that I want to seed in your mind as you recollect your previous studies and thinking about how Jesus taught. First, remember that Jesus taught with authority. Many marveled during Jesus' ministry at his ability to teach with authority. And as the Word, who spoke everything into existence, as the physical manifestation of God to us as the creation, having a hand in the thoughts and the character traits that are being communicated, it's no wonder that Jesus spoke. He taught with authority. And his authority is going to be challenged in the things that we're talking about this evening. So that's first. Second, relative to Jesus' teaching, Jesus taught and was a master teacher. He taught using props. He taught using object lessons that helped convey in a practical way and in an insightful way so that everyone could understand. And such is the case in these days when Jesus is daily going to the temple to teach. So that's one scripture. Another scripture that I want us to look at is Matthew 21 and verse 43. Matthew chapter 21 and verse 43. And I've got a very old iPad, and it is just getting painfully slow. I think I'm going to have to upgrade or go back to the tried and true, right? With the paper itself. All right, so verse 43. Jesus' words recorded here, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits." These words of judgment are spoken by Jesus against the Jewish rulers that confront him and about which the object lessons that we're going to talk about are focused, in my studied opinion. The events of these days and what Jesus is doing is about judgment. The Jews rejected Jesus, and God is rejecting the Jewish system of worship. A new kingdom is coming. A new order is happening. The old law is being ushered out. And a new kingdom established on the foundation of faith and the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is going to be ushered in. So that's another key idea and concept as we think about what's going on with these activities taking place. The last scripture that I want us to look at very quickly before we dive a little more deeply in is in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, and we'll read beginning in verse 55. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." So Jesus said these words when in Gethsemane, after having been betrayed by Judas and the mob coming to arrest him. At his arrest, Jesus has these words. And again, I want us to understand contextually, a few days before that happens, Jesus is publicly working, teaching, healing, having dialogue with the rulers who were behind that arrest. And it's happening in the light of day. In the morning, the crowds were coming to him. He's very publicly confronting and teaching and dealing with these items. And just a few days later, by night, a crowd is going to come and arrest him. So I hope that sets some good context for us as we jump into a discussion of object lessons. And there are a number of object lessons that Jesus uses during this week, and we're going to move over to the Gospel of Mark, beginning in Mark chapter 11, verse 12, and we're going to stay in Mark's Gospel as we step through each of these. So let's read verses 12 through 14 of Mark chapter 11. And he, that is Jesus, entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, it was already late. He went out to Bethany with the 12. All right, that's verse 11. So that happened on the first day of the week, Sunday. Okay? And then we come to verse 12. On the following day, that is Monday, on the following day, when they, Jesus and the disciples, came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. All right, so that's verses 12 through 14 of Mark's gospel. Now, there is some controversy relative to what's happened here, relative to Mark's account and Matthew's account. And so just want to mention that in Matthew chapter 21, beginning in verse 18 and following, Matthew describes this event, and Mark addresses this in verses 12 and 14 as we just read, and then later in verse 20, we pick up in Mark's recounting of what happened, the withering and what took place. So there's a couple of things that are controversial about these two records and accounts. The first is that Mark is very detailed relative to the sequencing and what's happening. Mark tells us that on Monday morning, Jesus was moving toward Jerusalem with his disciples, and he encounters the fig tree and he curses the fig tree. And Mark's account later says that the next day, that would be Tuesday, as Jesus and his disciples are returning to Jerusalem to go to the temple, they encounter the withered fig tree. Okay? And Jesus gives some explanation and expounds on what they're seeing at that time. So Mark sets this up as if 2 consecutive mornings are when these events happen. But Matthew's account makes it seem like the curse and the withering are happening at the same time. And if we read a little bit into Matthew's account, we might think that this is happening on Monday evening. Okay? And so to reconcile or understand what's happening in these two accounts, as I mentioned a minute ago, Mark is very detailed relative to the sequencing. He's telling the story of these events chronologically, sequentially. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. Matthew, on the other hand, is using a storytelling approach that is less sequential and more thematic. So that generally accounts for the discrepancy in terms of an apparent contradiction in sequencing. And there is no contradiction. We know Scripture does not contradict. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that there are different types of learnings. There are different audiences based on what we understand about the gospel writers and how things were constructed. Even today, there are television shows and other entertainment mediums that leverage the concept of flashbacks or flash forwards in a storyline, a narrative type storyline. And there can be benefit there because we as we're getting the narrative and understanding things, the author can help piece together some items and link items that otherwise we wouldn't see together. And so there's no discrepancy here. We just need to understand that one is being more specific and another is being a little more thematic. Okay? So all that said, we're going to jump into this object lesson a little bit more, but first I really want us to pause for a moment and appreciate what Mark shared in verse 12. Jesus was hungry. Ponder that for a minute. Jesus was hungry. Now, I don't want to see a show of hands, but maybe you can think about this. If I was asking for hands, I would probably raise 2. I just wonder how many times in my life I have uttered the phrase, "I'm starving," hours removed or hours ahead of a 1,500 to 2,000 calorie single setting meal. Jesus was hungry. Now, at the beginning, we're near the end of Jesus' ministry, but at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, what happened? Was Jesus hungry then? He was, wasn't he? He fasted for how many days? 40 days. That's right. For 40 days at the beginning of his ministry. And you remember, Satan tempted Jesus on the basis of that hunger. And Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4, and Luke chapter 4 and verse 4 gives us the record of Jesus' response. What was Jesus' response to that temptation while being hungry? What was his response? That's right. Man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And John's gospel, John chapter 6, one of the richest, deepest, in my opinion, chapters in the life of Jesus. John chapter 6, Jesus proclaims the fact that he is the bread of life. And he talks about how manna came down from heaven, and the forefathers ate of that manna, and those forefathers are now dead. But he, as the bread of life, has come down from heaven, and anyone who eats of him will never die. Don't miss the fact that Jesus on this day was hungry. The Creator, he created manna. He became bread, and he's hungry. He's hungry. Now, Jesus quoted from Deuteronomy. If you'll turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, we'll read verse 3. If I can get there right. I keep hitting the wrong things. There we go. So here, we're just going to pluck out verse 3 here. But and he, God, humbled you, children of Israel, and let you hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Don't miss the connection here. Humility and hunger provided lessons or avenues toward lessons that God ordained for the children of Israel. And Jesus called on those lessons when dealing with the attack from Satan. And here at the end of his ministry, Jesus is hungry. And we can't go forward without thinking through and appreciating the fact that Jesus is such a high priest. Hebrews 4, verses 14 and 15. He's been tempted in every way like we are, and yet without sin. He can identify with us. Jesus was hungry. Some might even say hangry. I wouldn't say that, but I mean, he was hungry in this circumstance. And just amazing, just amazing. So, Jesus curses the fig tree. Why did he, what object lesson, what's going on with that? Why would he curse this fig tree? It's not producing fruit. It had the appearance of a healthy plant, but it wasn't producing fruit. It wasn't satisfying the purpose of the Creator, the need, or meeting the need of the Creator for what it was created for. And I believe that when we get down, and we didn't read it, but if you read the verses later in Mark's account, down in verses 20 and following, in my mind, there is an idea here that Jesus is speaking and the disciples are hearing, and I think they're hearing in part because there is a tone of judgment that's being meted out here. This is an object lesson tied back to that passage in Matthew's account, in my opinion, Matthew 21:43. The religious leaders in Jerusalem were not producing the fruit. They were putting on airs. They looked the part, but they were not playing the part. They were not producing the fruit that God was expecting and needing and demanding. And therefore, a new kingdom is being ushered in. And just like the fig tree, the work that they had been involved in is cursed. And they're going to be removed from those positions of responsibility and authority. So let's go down and, go ahead, comment. That's interesting. I've read a number of commentaries. There may be some others in the room that have a more studied understanding of that particular item. Some of the commentators that I read suggested that with these fig trees in this particular area, generally the sequencing would be that a fruit would present, and later the tree would bring forth the full leaves. And so seeing a fig tree from afar, there would be an expectation that fruit would be present if it was heavily leaved. I don't know if that's in line with others that have studied that particular item or not. Regardless, the Creator has the prerogative to do what the Creator will do, and I think that the focus is really on this fig tree being an object lesson. When was the curse applied? While we're going to Jerusalem. The next morning, heading back to Jerusalem, we're witnessing the rapid decay and change relative to what's happening there with that fig tree. And I think the focus is on the parallel that's happening between that fig tree and what's happening and going to happen relative to the temple and specifically these religious leaders. That's, I think, the focus. Good thought. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so we're about to go there. I've got some ideas, whether it will prompt additional question or understanding or whatever. We can go there. Let's continue in Mark. We're going to read that particular Mark's account of the lesson from the withered tree here. We're going to begin in verse 20 and we'll read down through verse 24, and then we'll discuss some thoughts there. So as they passed by in the morning, and by the way, some of the commentators that I read suggested that there may have been, and there likely were, multiple paths connecting Bethany and Jerusalem that people would travel. And so if you can imagine there being multiple paths, in part because there's a lot of hilly terrain, there might be a preferred path to take in the morning and another path to take in the evening based on the sun, based on shade, based on steep ascents or descents or a gradual transition. And so maybe they took a different route out of the city on Monday evening and then returned to the same route they took the morning before. And that's why there is this difference of when they're seeing the fig tree. Just an aside. But coming back to it. So, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered." And Jesus said to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive your trespasses." So the second object lesson I would suggest that is being leveraged here is a mountain. Okay? Now, there are a couple of mountains that are prominent relative to the geography of this area. And I have a pretty particular opinion on which mountain Jesus is talking about. I don't think he's just talking about some far-flung mountain. I think he's talking about a mountain that's in their vicinity, in fact, likely in their eyesight. Say to this mountain. So what are some mountains that you know that are in this proximity? Sinai, okay. Sinai is depends on how you define proximity. I don't think they could have seen Sinai from here, but it's certainly relative to where we are. There's a lot of proximity, but it's still probably hundred-ish more, miles away. There are two that I'm thinking about. First, I mentioned earlier the Mount of Olives. Okay, the Mount of Olives is close, and it runs kind of parallel with Jerusalem and another mountain there, separated by the brook of Kidron. Bethany is kind of on the other side of the Mount of Olives, and so Jesus is passing over that mountain. And the other mountain I would suggest to you, and which I think is the mountain that Jesus is referring to, is we call Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, the mount on which Jerusalem stands. I believe that Jesus is using that mountain as an object lesson here. And so as we think about that, if you were to sum up God's intent for the work taking place at the temple, on the Temple Mount, in one word, and there are several words that are applicable, but if you were to pick one word to describe the supreme work, the primary work that was to take place at the temple, what word or words would come to your mind? I'm sorry? Destroy it. Well, God's going to destroy it. But in terms of when the tabernacle was crafted, and when the temple was constructed by Solomon, and God intended work to be done there, what was God's intent? What was the primary work to be done there? So worship, clearly worship is in my mind, an overarching word. Clearly worship is primary. Coming into the presence of God, okay? The word that comes to my mind, which is an offshoot a little bit of worship, is actually forgiveness. It's atonement. It's reconciliation and relationship, but it's forgiveness. There were things taking place uniquely at the temple relative to forgiveness. And so when Jesus, and prayers were part of that process, right? You remember what Jesus said when he cleansed the temple. My house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. You've turned it into a den of robbers. Prayer was characterized by what was taking place at the temple. So Jesus, in Mark's account here, references faith, he references prayer, and he also references forgiveness. Did you see that? Verse 25. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is also in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. I think Jesus is speaking of the destruction of the temple. If we say to this mountain, be cast into the sea, it can happen. And what is the basis of this new economy relative to worship, relative to forgiveness? Prayer is intended to continue, and it will, but the basis will no longer be incremental sacrifice, because there's going to be one sacrifice for all. We can do away with this temple, and you will, in the future, base your prayers on faith. Faith in the life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus himself. I think that those thoughts are wrapped up in what we have recorded here. This isn't some parenthetical statement about some fictional mountain, in my opinion. It's not some tangential reference to prayer and forgiveness. I think it's all related to what is happening this week and what's going to happen in the days and the weeks to come as the new kingdom is established first in Jerusalem and then carried to the uttermost parts of the earth. I think Mount Moriah is another object lesson that Jesus is referencing here. But there's another, and this was something that occurred again on the Monday, the day of the cursing of the fig tree, the day of the cleansing of the temple. I'm not going to take time to read this, but if you look at Matthew's account, Matthew 21 and 14, you see there that Jesus in the temple healed those who were blind and those who were lame. And we know that Isaiah 35, verses 4 through 6, reference a prophecy about the coming Messiah and just these kinds of miracles being performed. John, when John was in prison, John, Jesus' cousin, John the Immerser, when he was imprisoned, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask, are you the Messiah? Are you really the one? And Jesus, if you remember, in my paraphrase, basically said, take back to him the account of what you've seen, about how the lame are now walking and the blind are now able to see. Those were proof points that Jesus was, in fact, who he claimed to be. And I think the healing of lame and blind people in the temple on the day the temple was cleansed is another object lesson for us. God was clearly upset with what was happening in the temple, so much so that Jesus drove out everyone, as Kyle ably covered last week. So how can the place of worship, the place of sacrifice and forgiveness, the place of prayer get into such a bad state, except that some of the religious leaders were inept. They were lame, unable to correct the problems that have happened, or they were effectively blind and unable to see the true reality of what was happening there. I think the healing of these lame and blind people in the temple are yet another object lesson for us to see what is happening, that the hypocrisy of the religious leaders is no longer going to stand. And a new kingdom is going to be ushered in their place. Yes?
You said something about how did that happen? It made me think, going back to 2 Chronicles 34, that when Josiah, the good king, was king over Judah, verse 14 says, Hilkiah the priest found a book of the law of the Lord given to Moses. How do you find a book of the law of God except first you've lost it, or you've overlooked it, or you put it aside and you don't care?
Right.
And of course, there was a great repentance on the part of Josiah and the people in that area. And that, to me, says, how did that happen? Because they kept going farther and farther away from it.
They did.
And it seemed like it was coming from lack of knowledge.
Absolutely. No, great comments. Great comments. So another object lesson that I would propose to you is a big bucket. There's some smaller ones that fall underneath it. And I would say that it's the way in which Jesus taught. Jesus taught using parables. And there are parables that Jesus taught that are recorded for us. All three of these are recorded in Matthew's gospel. I'm not going to take the time to read them just for sake of time, but we know that parables essentially are where we lay two things that aren't directly related necessarily, but we lay them beside each other to draw and see comparison, to draw out a spiritual truth, to be able to see something a little more clearly because we're doing some side-by-side comparison. And I think that's exactly what's happening. If you look over in Matthew's account, Matthew 21, beginning in verse 28, there's a parable of two sons. They're invited to do some work for their father. One says, yes, I'll go, and doesn't. One says, no, I won't, but then repents and goes and does the work. There's a difference in lip service and life service. And that parable is followed by a very harsh statement by Jesus and judgment. But there's another parable. There's a parable of the tenants. And in that particular parable, Matthew 21, beginning in verse 33, an owner of a vineyard is going to go away, and he hires some people to tend that vineyard. And while he's in the faraway country, he sends emissaries back to take the fruit of the vineyard, and those emissaries are killed, and finally decides he's going to send his own son to go and get what's rightfully his, and they kill his son. And it's at the end of that parable that we read that scripture a few minutes ago, chapter 21, Matthew 21, verse 43, where Jesus said, the kingdom is being taken away from you because you're not producing the fruit of the kingdom. And there's a third parable that Jesus, it's recorded in Matthew's account, Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14, about a wedding feast. King puts forth a plan to celebrate a wedding, sends out invitations, and excuses abound, and no one shows up, and the king compels his servants to go into the highways and the byways and anyone and everyone to bring them to come and participate in this feast. And the intent behind this is that those invited didn't come, and so the king's going to invite others. Again, these parables are directly hitting on the fact that the Jewish leaders are being rejected by God. They're being removed, and a new kingdom is being established. Their hypocrisy is God's reached the limit. And all of these things are happening to satisfy the prophecies that were made. The confrontations are escalating, all rising to a crescendo that later in our study, Kyle hopefully will be able to take us to. So in the last couple of minutes that we've got, there are a number of other things that I wanted to touch on, and I'm slow getting to them. So there are a number of confrontations that are recorded. And staying in Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 27, there is a confrontation that occurs with the Sanhedrin. As Kyle pointed out a few weeks ago in our study, essentially that's not exactly, but there's a loose parallel to our Supreme Court. I mean, you've got the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, those in authority, and they're asking Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? Well, what are these things? These things include cleansing the temple, include the healing that he's doing in the temple. These include the lessons that he's teaching, and they saw very clearly, they understood. In fact, Mark 12 and verse 12 says very plainly that they understood that the parable that he taught was about them. They were connecting the dots. And so they asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? This was not a sincere question, and we know that because of the record that Mark gives us. They reasoned amongst themselves in terms of how to respond to the question that Jesus gave them. He said, hey, you've got a question for me, I've got a question for you. If you answer my question, then I'll answer your question. And they reasoned because they were afraid of the people. They did not ask that question sincerely. Later we see the Pharisees, a sect within the Jewish elite. The Pharisees take some of their disciples and they put them up to going to try and trap Jesus. Beginning in verse 13 of Mark chapter 12. And they're joined by some Herodians. Now, the Herodians were likely Grecian Jews, Hellenistic Jews, that had allegiance to Herod, who was ruling at that particular time. And so they sought to entrap him, and they used an age-old device for that, flattery, to try to soften where they were going. And they were using the Romans, who were in authority, to try to entangle Jesus. The wise man in Proverbs 29:5 talks about flattery as being a net at our feet. And Jesus wasn't, no surprise, Jesus wasn't taken. In fact, Jesus responded and confounded them relative to the paying of taxes. He answered in a way that none of the adversaries could have any issue with what he said. The Sadducees, seeing a potential opportunity, now the Sadducees were rivals with the Pharisees, as Kyle has pointed out. And in our day and time, often we get into circumstances and we might hear that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Have you ever heard that? If I've got an enemy and they've got an enemy, well, that enemy over there is maybe my friend. And I kind of see this situation as the Sadducees being opportunistic. Jesus has just rebuked some of the Pharisees. Hey, this is a chance. Jesus has got the ear of the people. This is an opportunity for us to kind of one up and maybe pull some of the people over to our side to help our case. And not believing in the resurrection, the Sadducees try to entangle Jesus in a discussion about the afterlife. And what would happen if this crazy circumstance and situation, comes out? What happens? Who would this person be married to if they were married to 7 brothers following the old law? And Jesus gives them a harsh rebuke. He says, you neither know the scriptures nor the power of God. And then we see a Pharisaic lawyer, a scribe, who may have been an accomplished debater, we don't know. Matthew's account tells us that when he approached Jesus, Matthew 22 and 35, he wanted to test him. But at the end of the encounter that he has with Jesus, Mark's account, down in verse 34 of chapter 12, Mark chapter 12, seems to give us a commendation from Jesus. Perhaps in this interaction, this Pharisaic lawyer may have approached Jesus with the intent to pile on and trap him, but maybe there was some degree of repentance, some degree of change in his heart based on this interaction with Jesus that resulted in an accommodation. I don't know. But Jesus has these interactions, and they're escalating through the process. And so turn down to the last couple of verses there of Mark chapter 12. We want to read, as we're wrapping up here, verses 38 through 40. Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 40. Again, this is a short version of something Matthew describes in much more detail. And in his teaching, he, that is Jesus, said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Now, in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 23, there's a much lengthier treatise by Jesus railing on the hypocrisy of these leaders and pronouncing numerous woes. In verse 36 of Matthew 23, Jesus says, "These things, the woes and the affliction, and ultimately the blood of the righteous slain will come upon this generation, these leaders." Jesus is pronouncing harsh judgment based on their hypocrisy. And in the last minute or so that we have left, you may have seen this before, but let's turn over to Matthew 24. Jesus is not done teaching. There's another area that he spends some time on relative to teaching that many refer to as the Olivet Discourse, because this happens on the Mount of Olives. And in verses 1 through 3, we see Jesus leaving the temple with his disciples. Now, he's been in the temple openly teaching. At this particular time in history, there is a massive remodel project going on in the temple. It's a big project. It took about 40 years to conduct. Jesus leaves the temple, and as he's going away, when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, beginning in verse 2, but he answered them, "You see all those, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." They're marveling at this huge construction job site. I've got a grandson who is all into excavators and dump trucks, and he can go through a book, and he's not three yet, he's 2, and he can describe and verbalize the key construction vehicles. And I can imagine that if he were in this situation, he would be awed by this huge construction site and construction job. And Jesus gets their attention, saying that these stones are not going to be laid on one another. And so there's a lot of false teaching that takes place as a result of what we see in this particular chapter. You've probably heard this before, but if not, I just want to give you a quick key to understanding this passage, and there are people here that are far more learned than I am in this regard. But if you look at verse 3, we see there, as Jesus, sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So depending on how you parse that sentence, there are 2 or there are 3 questions that Jesus is being asked. The first question that Jesus is being asked is, when will these things be? Referring specifically to the stones on the temple not touching, the temple being destroyed. And because of the magnitude, I'm convinced, of that event, a cataclysmic event for the Jew, that the temple would, the house of God would be destroyed, they asked the next question, or two questions, compound question, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Does everybody see a clear distinction in terms of those questions? If so, then the key to understanding what Jesus is sharing is beginning in verse 4. Jesus answers the first question. When will the temple be destroyed? Beginning in verse 4. And as you go down through the chapter, as you get to verse 34, you see Jesus say, "And truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And then Jesus uses a word "but" in verse 36. And that's where Jesus begins answering the second and third questions that were posed to him relative to when he will come, when the end of the world, the end of the age will occur. And Jesus says, "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." And he goes through and describes more. That little key will help you understand and interpret and apply what Jesus taught there. And again, I'm sorry that we ran out of time, that I ran long, but thanks for being here. Lord willing, Kyle will be back in his rightful place next week. Hopefully he'll heal to the point where he'll even be able to join us, Lord willing, this Sunday. But thank you for being here. And again, if you've got questions or comments, I'm certainly happy to talk with you, and have a good rest of the week. God bless you.